Hey everyone, it is George Couros. We are excited. And Katie, I don't know if the cameraman set up that it's going to be on you the whole time, so you might want to check out the YouTube video. But we are excited for the last episode of IMMOOC Season 4. I've been able to be here at the beginning and now joining at the end. As always with the awesome Katie Martin, who is been running the show. And really excited that Tom Murray is actually joining us. We had a really nice conversation before we started, sharing some ideas, and hopefully we'll dig into some of those things as we get into it. But I will turn it over to Katie. And Katie, just want to say hi to everybody.
All right. Welcome, everybody. We're excited. It's been a great 5 weeks and excited to have a conversation tonight. Excited that George is back to join us, and definitely excited to have Tom Murray join us as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom, who is the author of Learning Transformed with Eric Sheninger, and also Director of Innovation for Future Ready. Did I get that right?
You got that right, Katie.
All right. So he's going to tell us a little bit about himself and what he does, and then we're going to get into an awesome conversation. So go ahead, Tom. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, what's up, everybody? And it's awesome to be here with my good friends Katie and George, and thanks for tuning in tonight. So I'm Tom Murray. I'm the Director of Innovation for Future Ready Schools. It's a project of the Alliance for Excellent Education, which is a bipartisan nonprofit in Washington, D.C. We don't sell a darn thing. You can check it out at futureready.org. So there's no sales pitch with the work that I do there by any means. But with that, I spent 15 years in public schools as an elementary teacher first, as a middle school teacher after, as a middle school principal for a few years, elementary principal for a few years after that. I moved to district office, did that for a few years, obviously couldn't keep a job, so I went to DC. Makes total sense, right? And so I get to run that work. It's national, again, nonprofit, and it's a lot of fun because I get to work in my passion area. It's that quote along the lines of, like, you never feel like you work a day in your life as long as you're working in your passion, and I feel blessed to be able to do that. I love working with school leaders. I love seeing the amazing things going on in schools. I love working to help schools like transform what's going on from a learning end and so many different facets. I love working with everything from teachers to superintendents and everything in between. And so it's great work. It's rewarding work. It's exhausting work, like all of us, like those of us in schools there as well. But it's awesome to be here tonight. Thanks for the invite.
Awesome. So Tom, I have a question for you. Knowing, kind of like watching the progression of Future Ready schools as over the last couple years, it started off with a pledge. It started off kind of from my vantage point, like, hey, sign up for this pledge. We have some ideas. We want to connect people, and we want to think about how to move schools forward. And it's evolved into this awesome network of leaders coming together. You do a lot of professional development around the country. So I'm kind of curious what your insights are and what you've learned over the last couple of years. I think for me, in like how to build a network, and then what you've seen as a result of the network.
Sure. So, when I think about that, just your question, we've had over 3,200 superintendents sign on to the Future Ready District Pledge. A lot of them could look at it and say, like, hey, we've been doing this stuff for 10 years. Of course I'll sign on. For some in other districts, they look at it and it's certainly a step forward. I'll be the first person to tell you, signing a pledge changes nothing in your district. And I fully recognize that. We fully recognize that. But it's a public stand for the superintendent to say, we believe in this work moving forward. It's a baby step. And so, we started Future Ready, and President Obama kicked it off at the White House for us a number of years ago. And we started Future Ready with district leadership, and I'm all about empowering teachers and the amazing work that they're doing. But to change a system, to change a district, we felt we needed to get leaders on board first. And so it really started with superintendents. We have evolved a lot in the 4 years. But when you look at the pledge, it's hard to get 5 superintendents to do the same thing. So to get 3,200 superintendents that represent about 20 million kids that they're leading across the country here in the U.S., because it is U.S. focused for the work that we're doing. Sorry, George, no offense.
Okay, we're way ahead of you guys. We're way ahead of you, so we don't need it. But we just call it ready here.
Yeah, right. There we go. And so, in the work that we're doing along that, it really, really has evolved. Now we have 5 strands. District leadership is one. Principals is one. We have one for librarians. We have one for IT, which is a little bit more boxes and wires for the tech side. And then also one for instructional coaches and lead teachers. And so it really has continued to evolve. So some lessons learned, when we're trying to move the needle nationally, it is hard. I mean, moving things in terms of schools and systems, we're working in areas that schools have always been working in. We just try and bring things together from a collaboration end. It's been rewarding to work alongside groups such as COSIN and ISTE and AASA and NASB and NASSP, because Future Ready isn't just about the alliance by any means. It's a collaboration of over 60 organizations to leverage their tools, their resources. But Katie, I think the most rewarding thing is really where I started. We're doing amazing things in our classrooms. We're doing amazing things in our schools. The problem is it's often in pockets. How do we make sure that it's not just opportunities for our gifted kids, for our suburban kids, for our white kids, that all kids have the opportunity? We have vast issues with equity in our nation. When you look at research or statistics related to things about underserved students or opportunities or lack thereof, that many of our underserved students, which are traditionally students of color in many different ways, some of the facets of things that they have not had opportunities to do, it's really mind-blowing. And so we've got to do something about it. And so one of the main strands that we've really focused on in the past 4 years is this notion of equity, and not just digital equity, although we talk about it, access at home, access to devices, but access to opportunities and higher level opportunities, and so it's really been a fascinating feat. But I get excited, even though I'm on the road a lot. I get excited and I'm proud because I see the stories. I see the look in the eyes from the teacher that tells the story about something that happened with a kiddo and that it keeps him or her going. Or, you hear the story from the superintendent of the amazing work going on. And it doesn't mean we don't have struggles, because we certainly all do. But the rewarding part is seeing the impact on kids. And I don't mean that just from a Future Ready end. We're working to support, school leaders have been doing amazing things in school since the beginning of schooling. And so with that, our job is to simply support the incredible work they're doing and to support areas that they're struggling there as well.
Well, the thing that I find really interesting about what you said at the beginning when you were talking is there's this notion that school is going to be led from this like grassroots movement, that it's going to be teachers in classrooms. I actually don't believe that. And the reason, it's not that I don't believe teachers aren't, amazingly important to obviously what happens in classrooms. Obviously, they're the biggest factor. But the reality of it is, if you have really weak leadership, what I often see is those teachers get burnt out, they leave, they go to other school districts. And I've always talked about, it's not going to be, and it's not necessarily just like a leadership thing too, right? Like I always talk about like, it's going to be top down, bottom up, all hands on deck. And I think that if you have really great teachers, but really bad leadership, those teachers will become weaker or they'll go. And so I really appreciate, that focus on leadership to really, and the idea to serve the great teachers, not to, and to help develop them, as opposed to let's wait for the teachers to do this when they really don't have the power in many aspects of things that are really crucial, like equity and access that you're talking about, that, happen in classrooms every day.
Yeah, we got, and just being transparent, we got some pushback, or I get some pushback initially on social media. Why are you focused constantly on superintendents, or why are you focusing on district leadership admin? What about us? What about teachers? And, teachers have been doing great things in their classroom, but George, I agree with you 100%. It wasn't to demean teachers at all. It was to say, hey, if we're going to shift to school, we've got to get the principal on board in terms of mindset, something, a few things about, we've got to get the principal on board to truly empower teachers, so they're not just closing the door and doing things in their own classroom for their own kids. And, even more so in a larger district. And you're spot on, that culture side of things is huge when it comes to all this work, and principals and so on. Although everybody's responsible for it, principals certainly set that tone, or superintendents set that vision. And so that's why we started there. And, you can't be all things to all people. But one of the things we talk about professional learning, quite often professional learning is immediately focused on the teacher. And you understand why. You're looking to impact the classroom. You're looking to transform teaching and learning. But so many times the administrators get left out of the mix. Many times your administrators are the ones doing or standing up there, and not saying that should always be the case at all, but saying that's been the reality of many times they're leading it, they're planning it. What about their own professional learning? Who pushes their thinking in terms of transforming their own mindset moving forward? And so that's really what we set out to do.
Well, here, and I'm going to ask you, this could be, maybe this will be kind of a jerk statement to make, but if you were at a professional learning day and you saw someone get a phone call and walk out of the room, my bet that's more likely a principal or a superintendent than it is a teacher. And it says something really negative to those teachers, is that something else is way more important than this learning that's happening right now, right? Like I've seen it so many times that happens way more when I work with leadership, administrators, than it does with teachers. And you're right. Like if the admin if people aren't seeing them as, learners, then how do you actually, why would I would say this, like, how can you legitimately push someone to try something new and learn something if they're not seeing you do it themselves?
Well, I would jump, all three of us work with districts, same, from superintendent to teachers. And I can say when we work with districts where the superintendent or central office or principals come to the table ready to learn and engage with teachers, and it's not hey, just go teach my teachers and let me know what happens, versus like, let's engage in a conversation together. It's a much different conversation and it's a much different dynamic. And I think that's the point I think both of you are making too. When people engage and understand that they are part of this process, they're not just telling people what to do, but they're engaging as learners and trying to understand what's working in classrooms and what's not. Then principals and leaders in the central office can really help teachers move from those pockets, instead of saying like, hey, do whatever you want, really set the conditions and the culture to make sure that everybody can really move forward.
Yeah, and Katie, it is about their own professional learning. I think many times administrators think professional learning is about what everybody else has to do, as opposed to what they need to own and they need to be responsible with. One of the stories I often tell in terms of my own failure is and this really gets to modeling. I remember I was running I was an early principal. I was running a faculty meeting on a Monday. It was a 4 to 5 o'clock. And for the straight hour, I did what's easy to do, and I stood up there and I talked for an hour. And we've got to do this, and here's the responsibilities here, and because admin do have all sorts of managerial stuff on their plates. They've got a lot of stuff they have to disseminate. And as an early principal, I made the mistake of 60 straight minutes of me. And I talked and I talked and I talked. The next day I go into a 3rd grade classroom and I observed this 3rd grade teacher, and it was a 52-minute math lesson. And for 52 minutes, she basically talked. Mm-hmm. The following day, I had my post observation, and I'm sitting across from her, and I could show you where I was sitting. And I had in my notes, when you've got a captive audience for 52 straight minutes, especially of 3rd graders, you can't just talk the whole time. And I felt so sick to my stomach, because I realized the feedback that I was about to give to her is exactly what I did to her on Monday afternoon. And how in the world could I say to her, don't do this, when the day before I modeled to her? And so what I said to her truly is, I said, the day before, I said yesterday when we had that captive audience, because I didn't want to reaffirm her poor practice of just constant talking the whole time. But I'm doing it too. So I'll tell you, it was a humbling moment as a principal. And I said, Joanne, I said, you had that captive audience for 52 minutes. And you used some humor, and you were definitely used some inflection, and you had some good points that you made, but you really talked at them for the whole time. And then I said, and it's exactly what I did to you the day before in the faculty meeting. How do we both get better at that? And so many times for administrators, like every time we bring people together for a faculty meeting, or every time we bring people together for an in-service day, it's an opportunity to model. It's an opportunity to model the instructional practices we're looking for in a classroom. And it doesn't always mean we're standing up front. George made the case where, sometimes they're probably more likely to get up, answer a phone call, that kind of thing. But in that sense, what does it say to a teacher when you're sitting as a superintendent or as a principal, learning from them in some sort of professional learning, and the opportunity to follow up after, hey, I really enjoyed your session because I got to learn this and this. It was something I didn't know before. That's something that teacher might never, ever forget. And we certainly would want it to be authentic, but every time we bring people together like that, it's an opportunity for admin to model what they're looking for in the classroom.
I actually remember that I was leading a professional learning session, and it was full and there was not enough chairs. And I remember the superintendent like rushing out of the room, grabbing chairs for people, finding stuff. And it said something really powerful during that time. Like, he wanted to make sure that as many people get into it. But he also stayed, and he was part of the conversation, and he was there. And I just knew he was the superintendent because I met him earlier. But I actually, if I would have walked in the room, I would have had no clue. And I think there's something really powerful about that, to be able to see them, connecting and learning that way. And I think that servant leadership is so crucial.
Well, and I just want to say too, Tom, I think that to your point about this, the superintendent or you saying to your teacher, hey, how can we both get better at this? I feel like that is such an awesome question that more people need to ask. Like, where are we right now? Where do we want to go? And how can we get better? Instead of trying to always figure out what we want to tell other people to start doing, start thinking about, I know we've both said this in lots of conversations, like, how can I look at my practice and figure out what I can do better to be that model and to really create that culture so everyone can do it? I hear teachers all the time say to me, well, I don't know what my principal wants, or they do this and they sit there and just tell me what to do. And then they come in my classroom and they want to see something different. And there's that disconnect that exists in our classrooms and in what we say versus what we actually do. And closing that gap really is, in my view, about having those conversations and trying to better understand what do we want to see, and what is it, what are our prior experiences preventing us from doing, what are our norms and expectations preventing us from seeing, and how do we just get better at that one step at a time?
I want to actually ask both of you something, and I think it's really important to your point, Katie, is the idea of like that we as we as people being in leadership positions at some point, wrestling with our own learning. And I think that Tom, one of our first connections was I actually blogged about something you blogged about and connected, and we started, talking after then. And Katie,
we met online. You can say it. We met online. It's fine.
Yeah, we met online, right? We met online. And Katie, I know, I really gave you a push to blog as well. And you've both written books. I've written a book, and I know my blog is crucial. Do you see that's something as like a really transparent way, not to just, because I a lot of times when I write, I'll hey, I'm literally trying to figure this out right now as you're reading this. I don't even know what I'm going to say by the end of this. Do you see that process as being something that would be valuable to leadership and not only modeling, but this because a lot of times when people blog, it's here's how it is, not here's what I don't really understand. I'm trying to work it out through this process right now.
So George, let me give you my take on that. And I think it's a really valuable question. One of the things I really respect about your blog, and I will tell you, and anybody watching this, I truly will say it on record. I believe George's book, The Innovator's Mindset, is truly one of the best education written books ever written. I mean that wholeheartedly. But when you look at George, one of the things I respect about your blog, and I'll use you as an example because you're here, and I can share this. One of the things that I really enjoy about your blog is how transparent you are in terms of your own mindset shifting, your own failure in some regard, a lesson learned, and put it out there. But here's and it's not a but, it's an and. If I'm a superintendent, their struggle, and I can understand this, is if I put out certain things that are like failures or weaknesses, I'm thinking about my school board, I'm thinking about my community, I'm thinking about parents that could be reading it. And so I think it's a tough balance. And so out of respect for them, I would say, it's easy to share, hey, look at great things for kids. And one of the ways I would say with superintendents or principals, people in leadership positions, but also positions that can be highly political in a community, I would say, writing about kids, highlighting kids and sharing the great things about kids, you really can't go wrong there. We want to be, of course, cognizant of privacy, and things like that, but you're highlighting kids. But your point is blogging a way for your own personal reflection, your own growth. And I would say absolutely it is. Sometimes I blog because I'm thinking through things just like you are. Mm-hmm. But I think if we're really transparent about things, or we're really putting ourselves out there, if I'm a principal or I'm a superintendent, I can be in a really hard spot. What if that teacher that's constantly, breathing down my throat for whatever reason reads this and just now they're going to use it as ammo. See, I told you he didn't know what he was doing there. Or, if I'm a school board member and it's a tough scenario and I got my contract coming up, and we could say on one hand those are all excuses, but I think on the other side it's the reality of what our leaders in schools deal with. Is it's difficult in the vulnerability to, especially when I'm talking about things like failure. Hey, I made the wrong call here. It was the wrong decision for kids. We can do that having, moved on from being in schools, because like the story that I shared earlier, it's not like that teacher's coming back to me right now saying like, I knew you were wrong. It's because we have kind of a safer place, I think, in that regard here. But if I'm a current superintendent, I think it's a bit difficult to share some of those failures. I think there's probably ways to do it that could show, credibility, but at the same time, what's the purpose? If the purpose is to show your own learning, it's a great opportunity to model. But I think our school leaders can often be in a tough spot just knowing, hey, if I'm going to really put it out for the world to see, what does it mean for those people that as a school leader would like to see me go, and that becomes a difficult spot for them. And it's just a tough reality, I think.
So I'm going to jump in because to both of those points. One, Tom, I think that is an excellent point. And it's a reality that, the boards, superintendents face, like that's their reality, and that's who they have to look to oftentimes. And so putting themselves out there to be vulnerable is not necessarily an ideal state. I'm also wondering how we kind of shape that differently in, going forward, so that we can be more open and vulnerable to really think about best practices in schools, and how superintendents might create that condition for their principals and other leaders to really model that for teachers. Because I would say, to George's point, when I write and over the last, I think it's been almost 3 years since I've actually been writing on my blog. If you look at what I was writing at the beginning, lots of the ideas, but they've evolved. I often say I had all these sticky notes around my computer. I had lots of Word documents that never really got fleshed out because I never shared them with anybody. Once I started sharing ideas, they got so much better. I got better at writing. I got better thinking. I got better at processing because I had an audience that really made a difference. And people who pushed back and helped me shape those ideas. So I think that it's really powerful to blog. It's really powerful to just share your learning in general. And I talk about that doesn't just have to be on a website. Like, how are we getting into classrooms? How are we being more transparent in our practice and not just waiting till, the final project is done for you to come in my classroom? How are we being transparent in our learning? Hey, I have this new strategy I want to try. Come in my classroom and give me feedback. All of those things about being more public about our learning, I think, is where we can see the most growth.
Yeah.
No?
No, I don't agree with that. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just totally kidding. Katie, let's be honest. I made you blog.
Yeah.
Right? I totally made you blog. And like, I basically said, you guys
need me to moderate here. Do I need to moderate?
But this is not like, hey everyone, thank George for what Katie has written about. That's not what I'm saying at all. But here's actually an important question for you. How come you weren't before? Like, what held you back? Like, what was your resistance when I first coaxed you in the first place? I think that's what was your thinking then?
Yeah, a lot of things. I thought, who cares what I think, right? Like, I thought a lot of times, and people will still ask, like, do people really care what I think? Who am I to say this? And so when I shifted my thinking from I'm an authority to tell people something versus like, this is my space to reflect and learn, and that shifted it for me. And now I like literally have lists and lists of blogs and ideas, and I think in blogs in some sense. I think things happen, and I process things when I actually write it. And I realized how many ideas and practices got lost because I didn't actually write them down and share them in a way. I mean, and like when I first started teaching 15 years ago, I remember thinking, I want my classroom to look like a living room. Like, I want to go to Goodwill, and I started like I wrote a grant and doing all these. If I would have started sharing my learning and like connecting with other people rather than just like living inside my own head, I would have made such a different impact for my kids because I would have thought differently about it. And instead, I thought I was the only person thinking that. And I didn't realize how many more people had those ideas and were actually doing things in their classrooms. And so I just think, one, sharing your ideas, processing them with people, and then just having that space to grow publicly, it really does make a huge difference. And George, you made all the difference for making me blog.
It's that focus on learning, right? And there's actually a quote that I shared in my book, and I just pulled it up, and it's really powerful. It's from Seymour Papert, And instead, if I want to become a better carpenter, I'll go find a good carpenter and I'll work with this carpenter on doing carpentry or making things. And that's how I'll get to be a better carpenter. So if you want to be a better learner, I'll go find somebody who's a good learner and with this person do some learning. But this is the opposite of what we do in schools. And I think that idea, like, I know that we all believe this, and I think it's something that we all, to be honest, I hope that we try to model, is it's not coming from a place of authority, but a place of we're active participants in our own learning, because we're trying to, I hate when someone says like, oh, you're like, I hate when people connect me with ed tech, first of all. But the reality of it is I'm not trying to be an expert with technology. I'm trying to have just a really good understanding of learning. And I think that even outside, like, people say, oh, you haven't taught in years, right? Or like you've lost some credit. Like we've, been on the classroom, and there's totally things that we don't understand to the same point on the respective teaching. And I think that all of us are focusing on the learning aspect, which should drive what is happening in the classroom. And I think that, if a teacher can't ever have time to focus on their learning, how are they continuously honing that craft when you are to serve like the papper? If you want to be a better learner, you need to learn, right?
Well, and I think part of it is like we don't create space in school for teachers to be learners. Like the irony of being organizations that are about learning, we are not truly learning organizations in a lot of spaces. And, teachers all the time say, we need time for that. Like 45 minutes on a Wednesday once a month is not time for learning. So when are we building that in? When are we prioritizing the time for teachers to connect, to learn, to reflect, and do the things that we know are important for professional learning?
Building space and time.
Right.
Space and time.
Right. And not, to Tom's point, of not someone's. So I think a lot of times unions have stepped in and said, we no longer are going to let you have this time, because principals, without a better model, have jumped in and filled that time with talking and mandates and explanations, rather than leverage that time to actually learn. And I think it's a really delicate balance. Like, I'm not going to come in here and say, like, I know the perfect formula, because it's going to be different in every space.
Yeah.
But I do know it's not someone talking at someone every time you have free time or meeting time. And I also do know it's not just saying, hey, teachers, I trust you. Go do whatever you want every hour for a week. There needs to be some guidance and structure so that it's productive and meaningful.
And need to have a vision. There's so much that you guys just had a nice little 5-minute back and forth. I don't even know where to start to jump in. In terms of why aren't people blogging, I think it's your common excuses that I first used as well, as I don't have time. Now listen, like I say that still currently. I look at George, who's knocking out like 3 things a week, and I'm like, holy gosh, like George and I both fly multiple times every week. We both have little ones at home. I mean, I got multiple little ones at home. And so yeah, time is an issue. That's also a reality. But, George, I think you actually wrote something on it maybe about a year ago. Part of my issue is I'm slightly a perfectionist in certain ways, and I know that's common for teachers. Teachers want to do things really well. They want to put it out, a perfect product, because you think about, as teachers, you kind of walk kids through this product, and what do you hand in? It's this perfect final copy. And I think part of this notion is like, it's got to be this perfect product online. And George, I remember you writing about, it was some sort of blog where somebody contacted you because you had a spelling error or whatever.
Bear with me, B-A-R-E.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I had to stop reading because you spelled that word wrong. And I just laughed, because I was like, I think that leads to the fear of teachers are perfectionists by nature. They want to do this perfect job, which you can understand. I mean, it's just part of who makes them what they are. But I think it's part of this fear. If I hit publish, it puts me out there for some criticism. It puts me out there like, what if, to your point earlier, Katie, what if I put it out there and nobody likes it, or, nobody shares it out? Does that mean nobody liked it at all? Or, and I think we ask ourselves some of that questions. As educators, we can be our own worst critic. Sometimes our biggest critic is the person that I haven't shaved in a while, but the person that I shave with in the morning, it's me when I look in the mirror. And so I think part of it is
so you don't reflect as much as you should then.
Yeah.
You don't shave.
But yeah, exactly. And part of it too is I just think, the time, like you guys were saying, in the space, just to get to your point there with related to professional learning, so many times you're spot on. And I could tell story after story of when I failed with that, where we use the time we do have in a contract or whatever it might be. And it's like, okay, we've got this time. Now, how do we fill it? and it's like this meeting in search of a problem. And it's like, all right, what do? We've got to schedule 4 to 5. And then when we do model these poor practices, yeah, unions start to push back, being like, it's a waste of time, and you're telling me you want more next time. You know, that's a culture shift. That's a mindset shift. That stuff takes time for sure. But I enjoyed your back and forth there, because there's a lot of great conversation going on.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about that notion of perfection, because I think what we have to understand is that we are the product we're trying to create in education is actually the process.
Yep, agreed.
Is actually the learning. You're not actually trying to create a finished thing at the end. It's that, and perfection is the enemy of that, as is controlling, which we know can be an issue in lots of classrooms. Is we're trying, and Katie, you just wrote a post about this, about like over scaffolding, and basically like, if you're just saying, okay, here's what, you know, going through every single step, what has actually been learned other than to follow directions, right? And so I think that's part of it, is we have to kind of get over that for ourselves, because it's actually inhibiting us when we actually serve the learners. That we have to understand that there's so much gray that we need to like wrestle with and struggle with. And, you know, we talk about our kids being critical thinkers, but often we're not. And that is a challenge. But I just want to, just for the sake of time, Tom, you read the book. It's Learning Transform, correct?
Yep.
And lots of great reception. I just want to make sure I got the title right. Sorry, buddy.
Yeah. Thanks, buddy. Proud to call you a friend.
No, I know it's LT8 keys is your hashtag, correct?
Yeah, and I enjoyed reading the innovation mindsets, something like that. It was pretty solid too.
I said it right. I said your book right. No, but I know it's been very well received. It's helping a lot of leaders. Can you just kind of tell us like kind of what the big premise of the book is?
Sure. So Eric and I work people through. Eric and I both, you know, like you, George, like you, Katie, work with a lot of school leaders around the country. We hear a lot of things, a lot of struggles, a lot of areas. A lot of it also from my work with Future Ready Schools, taking a look at, you know, schools that are transforming, districts that are transforming. What is it about them? What are the areas that they're working in big picture? You know, system change takes time. So part of it is, it's not just studying an individual classroom, taking a look at, you know, a dynamic teacher. It's stepping up a level from a district end, from a school end. So we studied and researched for about a year, taking a look at what are schools that work actually doing. And so one of the things I'm most proud of in the book is highlighting the incredible things that are happening around the country. We have well over 20 stories written by superintendents of the year, principals of the year, a CIO of the year, highlighting their story from struggle through running through roadblocks to success, and what they're actually doing in a number of areas. And so as we dove into the different pieces, we take a look on everything from, you know, our first key is leadership and culture set the foundation. You know, and I know we were talking a little bit prior to going live, just the importance of leadership and how leadership really does set the tone, but also recognize that leadership is not just by title. You know, some of the best school leaders I've ever met in my life, that 4-year teacher that runs through the walls for kids every day, or even support staff members, that's a backbone to that community. But then taking a look at this notion of how do we redesign learning? And I know, George, that's an area you talk about there as well. How do we move from that industrial era type sit and get regurgitation-based methodology to something that's more engaging, more authentic? You know, I know George published with you is AJ and their book on empower, and just how to empower kids for real world authentic learning experiences, as opposed to kind of that one size fits all. To the notion, a couple other areas that we hit, things like learning spaces, the importance of learning space redesign, which is not about being pretty for Pinterest, by the way. It's an area I'd love to talk about here. We see a lot of that on social media. You know, like, look at my cute, pretty classroom and look at the cutesy decorations that have nothing to do with learning. And what is it that actually impacts learning from a brain science end when you're in a classroom? And I'll tell you, those are areas that I was completely ignorant of as a teacher and as a principal. And that's, so we dove in from kind of research to practice. What does that look like? To give you an example, you know, sometimes we think about, when I'm working with school admin, the notion of learning space redesign comes up, and I've done enough work with them. You know, I can start to see the eyes go to their head of like, this would be a conversation if I had lots of money to spend. But, you know, something like a learning space redesign is not about spending money. It's about awareness and about mindset. And we could talk about some of the evidence and stuff behind there on what schools are doing that are working. And, you know, for that case, we highlighted a school district in Pennsylvania, Elizabeth Ford, where they've taken a look and they've noticed things on and taking a look at how design impacts the brain and impacts learning. And it's not about it's cutesy for Pinterest and look how cute it is. Let's decorate. And I think sometimes we're seeing some issues with that on social media. Another area we hit is personalizing professional learning. Taking a look at something like that, the evidence essentially is the top down, one size fits all, sit and get, hours-based accountability really doesn't show any impact on student achievement. Yes, we spend billions of dollars a year here in the United States doing that. Like, what is it actually works? Essentially, how do we make learning more personal? How do we get that ownership side of things? Another area that we hit is the effective use of technology. We are spending billions of dollars, again, I'm throwing US numbers at you here, even more when we look globally. But you look at things like OECD reports and the headlines essentially come out. The more technology we put in classrooms, more learning doesn't necessarily occur. And I want to write the op-ed that just says, thanks, Captain Obvious, because it's about the instructional pedagogy side of things. The device might be a tool in that regard, but we can be 3-to-1 in the classroom. But if we're not shifting the instructional model, nothing's going to change. Why would we expect it to? Yet here in our nation, what do we see? Go to the average conference and 50 apps in 50 minutes, and it's jam-packed down the hallway. Put the session next to it, shifting instructional practice, and 5 people show up. And it's how do we take a look at what actually works in that area? And it's not just that we went paperless or that everything's a digital. Because at the end of the day, who cares? Focus on the learning first and amplify it through the technology. And what does that look like?
Why do you think that is, though, Tom? Why do you think that? Because those are teachers choosing those sessions.
Yep.
Why do you think?
So a couple pieces. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I've had this conversation with a lot of conferences. George, you and I are both at a lot of conferences, and those that plan the conferences, that it's examples that we give. Because on one hand, I'm a conference, I know those sessions are going to fill. So why do I think that is? On one hand, on a positive, if especially teachers, they like the takeaway. They like, hey, here's something I can try tomorrow in my classroom, where something bigger picture, philosophical. Sometimes it's easy to leave being like, what do I do differently tomorrow? And so, I think it's where's the balance with this? Because on one hand, the 50 apps in 50 minutes, it's not inherently bad. It's exposure. But sometimes we're leaving, okay, now I have 2 or 3 quick tools. I can do something for 10 or 12 minutes. It's not awful. It's just,
I would say it's awful.
I would say it's awful. Most times it's going to be low level in terms of a variety of sense, or I'm doing 1 app per minute.
Right.
So it's kind of let's throw it and see what sticks. And so again, from an exposure end, maybe there's some value there, but why are those jam-packed? I think they like the practicality, but I think we've got to be careful with those kinds of things.
Well, I'd also say that it's the practicality, but I think that people like feeling like they can do something within their locus of control. And when you say, hey, tomorrow you can use this app, teacher in the classroom, they feel like this is something I can do given the context of my principal who may or may not be an excellent leader, my district who may or may not be pushing some different practices and expectations. This is something I can do within my classroom. So I would agree, the 50 apps in 50 minutes, and I think both of you have talked and written about, as I have too, that the more we just push more stuff, we don't actually know what's working. And this notion, this is the next question I'm going to throw before we get into audience questions. We talked about this before we got on. How do we know it's working? How do we know that an innovative practice that too often is technology and a shiny thing? People say I'm an innovative educator because I'm one-to-one or because I use Flipgrid. Flipgrid's great, but that does not make you an innovative educator, nor does it make you have an impact on your classroom. And so I'm going to throw it to you guys. How do we know that what we're doing is actually working versus just adding more and more stuff and stressing the majority of people out without actually having an impact on our kids?
So in Learning Transformed, we wrote a chapter on that is called Return on Instruction, the ROI of in that area. And there's a balance here. When you take a look at something, I wrote a post back in December, and the title of the post was, "No, your 3D printer does not make you innovative, period." And I got some hate mail about it. I don't really care because it was I wrote what I've seen across the country. Let me give you an example. Sometimes we're celebrating on social media, look at this awesome 3D print that I have, that I downloaded the code and printed it out. Many times when I've witnessed this firsthand, how are we using something like a 3D printer in our school? We walk our little 2nd graders down, they go down to the library, boys and girls, today we're gonna 3D print, let's watch this duck for 40 minutes, it's bzzz. 40 minutes later, we're look at the duck that we just printed, look at this amazing work. And the little kids are like, yay, this is amazing, and they learn nothing in the process. And if that's how we're using the device, it is a colossal waste of money. But that 3D printer can also be used to change the lives of kids. And I don't say that lightly. When you see some of the areas where kids are creating and designing like prosthetics for other kids around the world that need it, you know, that's an innovative practice. It's not the 3D printer's fault how it's used. And so when you take a look at that, something like a tool can be used for incredibly low level, or it can also be used for much higher level. It's not the device's fault. And so when you look at something like a 3D printer, sometimes we're celebrating the print in the sense of the print is like the reward. Once the race has been run, the print is the reward. Where's the learning with a 3D printer? It's in the design and the iteration process, and then the prints that fail, and then the fixing and the redesign and the iteration, and the final print is the reward. Because this generation of kids, they're not impressed by, look at this 3D printed thing that I print out. They're really not, because they've had it their whole. We as adults were impressed because we're used to just printing on paper. And so when we take a look at a tool like that, a 3D printer or something, just to pick one example, can be used as a tool for personal learning, like for learning that's personal, learning that's authentic, learning and design that's very high level. Or it can simply be used to print things that should have just been purchased at the dollar store because it would have been cheaper to do so. And so when we look at that, it's not the tool's fault how it's used. Another example real quick, and getting kind of to the why, going back to George's question earlier, you know, we've seen so much around the country where as budgets have remained stagnant for the past 12, 13 years, you know, the cost of ed tech in terms of what we're doing continues to skyrocket. And so why? We're going one-to-one in all these places. But to be crystal clear, like you can go one-to-one in your building. Heck, you could be 3-to-1 in your building. But if the instructional pedagogy side doesn't shift, you're really just wasting money. Yeah. The National Ed Tech Plan, just final piece, the National Ed Tech Plan, I love how they took the notion of interactive learning from some research that's out there related to, say, the effective use of ed tech. And let me be clear, too, because I've been talking ed tech stuff. Innovation and ed tech do not go hand in hand. Like you can do innovative things with ed tech, absolutely, but you can also be very innovative with no ed tech at all. I should have probably said that at the get-go. But let me give you an example here. I just like the way the National Ed Tech Plan lays this out. They take a look at, say the use of something like ed tech. You can use it, and they took the notion of interactive learning from some research and evidence and said, well, ed tech can be used in an active way or in a passive way. And when you think about passive use, that's your consumption-based use. I'm looking at a static website, I'm listening to a video, and we're gonna do that at times in the classroom, but sometimes we're celebrating, like I'm one-to-one, I'm paperless, everything's in Google Classroom. Like at the end of the day, who cares? Because you've said nothing about learning. You can be all paperless and all in Google Classroom and all low-level learning, or you can be higher-level learning. So we've got to focus on the learning first, and then technology is an amazing amplifier along the way. But the warning is technology can also amplify poor instructional practices and lead to lower-level learning for kids. And so we've got to be careful on that kind of double-edged sword related to that.
And that's why actually when you talked about that's why I actually do believe the 50 tools in 50 minutes is a terrible idea, because the focus of that is surface level, no depth. And the thing, it's like I always bring this up, is that we'll say, what do we want from our kids? We want them to be like deep thinkers, critical thinkers. You know, we want them to have like go beyond the surface, like really have engaged, empowered learning. So why are you using that app? It is so easy. It is just so easy, and it's like the easiest thing that we could do. And so that's why, like, keeping going back to this conversation over and over again is why we really need to immerse ourselves as learners, is because if we are looking for the easy out on how to do things, then that kind of trickles to the classroom, and then we get very surface level learning. But I also look at, you know, and I talk to schools about this all the time. Like, you know, I'm obviously a big advocate of technology, even though I never use the term ed tech, because I don't, like, a photocopier is ed tech, but we didn't refer to it as ed tech because it's stupid. And like, it's just like, we don't need to use that terminology anymore. But I always say this, is that like I'll say, like, hey, are your schools one-to-one? Are they bring your own device? And like, oh, no, we're not there yet. And I'll say, okay, like, I need, like, you should think about how you get there, but I want you to understand this. Don't go there tomorrow, because if you don't actually change your practice, but then you give kids phones, they'll do the same thing that a lot of staff members do. They'll check their Facebook, they'll do whatever, and you're going to have a mutiny, because you're going to have a bunch of kids with devices with super boring, you know, instruction. And don't blame kids for this, because adults are just as bad or worse. That if we're not connected to what we're actually doing, we will check out, we will do things. It's not just a kid thing. We're like, we can talk about this being kids. This is new to all generations right now, and we're all trying to figure it out. We're all trying to deal with it. But yeah, I totally agree with you. You know, that idea is that we need the deep learning, you know, in our classrooms and start from there. I do want to ask you one question, and I know Katie wants to. Katie, you got something to say on this?
I do have something really quickly to say before you go into your question, George.
Yeah.
We have about 15 minutes left, so I just tweeted, but make sure that you post your question. So before George goes into his last thought, post your questions so that we can have the last 10 minutes and answer those. Okay.
Hey, I want to give a shout out to Rich. And Rich, if I goof up your last name, I apologize, but I believe it's Rich Violanti. Love what he just said. I had me laughing over here on Twitter. He just says, using a 3D printer and calling myself innovative is logically akin to standing in a garage and calling myself a car. More is needed. And a great segment. Thanks, Rich, for your comment. I thought that made me laugh out loud. That's a great point. But yeah, George, good points there as well.
So this is a conversation we started having before we got on air, where the notion of best practice and research, there's a really great line. I think it's in Jamie Nodder and Maddie Grant's book. And it talks about like best practice is the enemy of innovation, right? And so a lot of the stuff that you talk about in your book is, you know, it's like been researched and like this is stuff that works. But also, Katie talks about this often too, you know, like the research toward Blockbuster had shown that the Blockbuster model was working, but the context in the future had changed. And so where do you see, because innovation is not based on research because it wouldn't be innovative, the idea of new and better. So where do you find this balance of, here's the stuff we know works, and I always say this, every best practice we know was once an innovation. Somebody said things aren't working the way they are, so they did something differently. And with all of this stuff that's going in front of us, how do you find that, or how do you promote that balance of, you know, focus on the research and what has worked, but also like try to be innovative and the intersection of the two?
George, Katie, you jump in first. Ladies first. Go ahead.
So I'll just jump in because this is something that I definitely am super passionate about. And I definitely love my fair share of research and make sure that I am anchored in that. But I always go back to thinking about being a mom. And I wrote about this a while ago. But when I first had my kids, there's research on how I should sleep train them. And then there's research on how I should be at their, be at the beck and call and just like do everything for them. There's research to support anything I want. And there's research to support what I don't. What I had to do was understand what was being said, and I understand my beliefs and the context, and I had to figure it out for my kids. What worked for Abby did not work for Zach. The context was different. They had different tendencies, but I also had to best understand what my decisions were based on. So when I think about that as a teacher and in education, we can't just say this worked. There's plenty of research that says homework doesn't work, yet we still continue to do it day in and day out. And I still continue to get it sent home with my kids, and so do lots of parents. So I think this notion of like research and best practice is overused to support what we want. And I don't think it's necessarily, we talked about this earlier, being critical thinkers about like, what is the end goal? Like, what is it that we want for students? What is it that we want to produce in our schools? What's the type of learning? And then let's look at what type of practices can get us there. Too often you're like, hey, this is what we have to do because research says this, yet it's actually not serving our goal. So the other point I'll make on this is PLCs. There's lots of research on the benefits of PLCs. There's also lots of research that they don't do what they need to do. And so it depends on what actually happens. I've sat in lots of PLCs where teachers just go through and fill out a worksheet and there's like zero thinking happening. But we have PLCs mandated across the country. And so instead of mandating the practice, what are the learning experiences we want to happen? What are the end results that we want to see? And how is that translating to how we meet, how we connect, how we learn? Not just mandating a process for people that worked in one set of conditions.
Yeah, so lots of great points. And George, I think your question is awesome. I really do. And Katie, I agree with you there in that you can probably look up most things and find somebody that said something somewhere along the way, call it some sort of research to justify a point you want to make. And, you know, what's interesting in Learning Transformed is there's many chapters that we found just that. We found contrasting research. I'm thinking about our professional learning chapter and certain practices, some major studies saying, nope, totally ineffective. Other major studies saying that's the top 2 ways we suggest to do it. And we point that out, like, how can there be research that completely contrasts each other? And what would be the natural thing? You know, well, I'm going to make the argument that I want to make. I think, and George, we talked about this a little bit earlier, you know, I think that's evident where we see social media use of adults. You know, social media, and there's been some research, right? The places like Common Sense, as an example, has started to look at, well, what do people share on social media and how much more inept they're willing to share something that goes along with their beliefs and thought processes. You know, so during the election season, people that were pro-Trump were much more sharing things. They saw something that was anti-Hillary, they shared it right out because it went along with their beliefs, or vice versa. You know, you can be anti-Hillary, but you know, you go back and forth. It's just an example I think we can all relate to, and things we see on a Facebook or on a Twitter or those kinds of things. You know, but I would say we can also look at, I don't think any of us can make the argument that research is totally irrelevant. It doesn't matter, those kinds of things that we've looked at, because we could make counter arguments. And here's what I mean. One of the examples that I often use, and I referenced with professional learning earlier, you know, find a study out there that shows what we've traditionally done is effective at all. You know, top down, one size fits all, sit and get hours based. Okay, find evidence that shows it's been effective. Now, one of the things, Katie, I think you were getting to that I think is really good is, so many times we generalize research, or we look at, well, what was the conditions? Here's an example. You look at research studies on the effective use of ed tech. Some of them are from like 15 years ago. Just process that. How much has the notion of technology in classrooms changed in the past 5 years? So go back to George's example of, well, the research on Blockbuster showed it was working. Here's a major issue we have with research. It takes so darn long for something to get published from when actually it's done. It's years in process that quite often research studies, the latest ones, have studied things from like 4 or 5 years ago. Think about how much classrooms have changed in just the past 4 or 5 years. Because the counter argument could be, well, if Blockbuster had up-to-date research on a monthly or yearly basis, you know, up-to-date evidence, they would have seen we're going down the tubes, and maybe we should have purchased Netflix when we could have. And so when you look at it, yeah, if your research study about Blockbuster was 10 years old, saying Blockbuster's thriving and Blockbuster's model works, well, it did work at that point in time. And to George's point, it was a best practice. It's all we did at that point in time. But the research is going to shift when new tools become available. Streaming wouldn't have been available early on, but now it is. So why would we do it? You know, it's funny, Katie, relating to my own little girl, I explained about 2 months ago to her. She said something along the lines of, you know, I mentioned something about Blockbuster, and she said, well, Daddy, what's that? And I said, well, you know, when your mommy and I went to go get a movie when we were first married, like, we had to go to the store, we had to pick it up, we had to drop it off, we had to go back a couple days later, and she just gave me this puzzled look. Because at 8 years old, she's never even remotely had to do that, you know. And so as things change, as things evolve, if we're going to look, and we need to look at evidence, it needs to be a consideration, but we also need to make sure that it's up front. If I'm citing research from 1960, there's probably a problem with that because things have changed a lot in there. You know, it's kind of like this, and here's the analogy that I'll make. When we think about kids, and George, I love your quote on, like, you know, data-driven is the worst, or however you say it. It's like,
stupidest term in
data-driven is the stupidest term. We're kid-driven. And think about what we often do, to your point there, George. We'll take like a piece of data or 2 pieces of data and make this huge summary around kids. Is that the best way to teach? But to say that no data ever matters and we shouldn't use it anyway that's just negligence, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But if we were to say, here's one point, let's make the assumptions, I think the same can be said about research. I think you could take one study, and, you know, this study that had 100 kids, one in Australia, and then we make these vast generalizations and vast claims. But in the same sense, if we never use it at all, I think we're doing a misservice there as well. So where's the balance? Where's the kid? And let's step back at times and say, where's some common sense in this mix as well?
Yeah, and I think there's a connection to obviously something you said earlier, talking about the notion of equity of opportunity in our classrooms, because the reality of this is not every kid is excited about the same opportunity. So we really have to understand the students. Like, if we like focus on every kid becoming a YouTuber, well, how is that a good thing? right? Like that's not what all kids want and see this, right? Even though some adults are like, oh, that like kids would love that. Well, not necessarily. And so the thing is, I think that research definitely obviously has a place, but I say this all the time. The best research any educator can do is know the kids in front of them. Because as you learn about those kids, the context of the research that you can get from, you know, last year, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, some of that will know your students, but you have to understand that, you know, places, it's the idea of like, oh, if we just did what Finland did. Well, Finland's a very different culture. So like there's some different context. You can't just do what Finland does in their schools because the culture outside, excuse me, outside of the school is significantly different. Now, can you learn from what Finland did? Absolutely. There's tons of stuff you can pick up. And I think that if you're really looking at this, the thing that is a non-negotiable to me is building relationships, knowing your kids, connecting with them. I don't really need research on that, to be honest with you. And you see it that if you really look at schools, we see kids more disengaged as they get older, but you also see the relationship becoming way less important as they get older, right? Because when they start getting a junior or middle school, then they have, you know, specialty teachers, you know, and then high school, it's like, you know, cattle. And then university, I didn't even show up to half my classes because there was 500 kids and I was a number. And if I could just see the notes online, why would I go? It's so boring, right? And so I think that we have to actually look at that stuff. Katie, can you mute me? Because I'm going to have dogs barking in about 2 seconds.
Yep, I'm going to mute you. And I also, here's my final question. So I will send it to Tom first. We have a question from Rod Luckenbill, and he's asking for advice on leading innovation from the AP desk. And I'll add to his question too, just like when you're not the formal authority, how do you lead in those spaces? So Tom, why don't you kind of take that as your final thought?
Yeah, and I'm guessing where Rod's coming for that. You know, AP is often looked at, and it's certainly on the norm, a well-respected, wow, that must be rigorous. But the difficulty, and I think this is where Rod's going with this question, or as much as you can go within 200 and whatever 80 characters at this point, is so much of it's often scripted. So much of it's, this is exactly what you have to do. It's how they maintain kind of quality control. You know, I'd get back to, and this goes to George's point, first and foremost, in the relationships in your classroom. You know, let me make a different argument at first. Sometimes we'll use the argument, and I know APs are a bit specific here, you know, we'll use the argument of, you know, we've got these standards, we've got this test at the end of the year, so we can't do anything innovative because I've got to teach to this test because that's the end thing. Like that's a mindset piece, because yeah, no, you have these standards and yes, you have a test, but how you teach things is under some of your control. But I will say I've worked with districts where, nope, you've got to be on page 42 on day 7, and that's the way it has to be. And the more scripted we do that, the more we take the art out of teaching, the more we take that side out of teaching, the harder it is for those teachers. I will fully agree with that. But I would say take the context of what are those things that you're kind of forced into, but what's the best way you can do it for kids? And going back to George's point, when we have those dynamic relationships with kids, when we know them as individuals first and foremost, and agreeing with George that kids are not data points, they are children, and let's look at the whole child. What can we do under the context of, if this is the standard, or this is where I need to work, this is the objective that I'm working toward, what is the best way that the kids sitting in front of me will learn that? And point being, that might be a bit different from period 5 to period 1. And what that actually looks like, because even those groups are going to be unique. And so I'd say, number 1, start with the kids. Number 2, start with what it is those kids need. Number 3, you know, certainly what is it from a curriculum or a content end that I'm required to do, because things like AP, you do. I don't think we can just blow things out and say, nope, I'm not doing any of it, because yeah, you're not going to have the opportunity to do much of it at that point forward any longer. So when we take a look, what is it the kids need? What are innovative ways to do it? How can we think differently in the way we approach the delivery, but also ask kids? I guess that'd be my biggest thing is, you know, hey, here's what we've got to learn. What's a way that you would want to learn this? If you were responsible to stand up here up front, 11th grader, how would you teach this? And, you know, student voice, student agency, I think is something that we underutilize. I underutilize it as a teacher all the time and as an administrator. And so just some general thoughts off of Rod's question there, but a great question.
Awesome. So I'm going to jump in and just my thoughts on that. Whenever, I think the question basically is like when you're not the formal authority. And I would also just question that just because you are the formal authority, do you actually get to make those changes just by actually being the one in charge? And I think I would question that if you don't have relationships, if you don't know the people, and you're not bringing in people collectively to make those to have those conversations. It doesn't mean just because you're the leader, you're going to just automatically make those changes. So whether you're a teacher in the classroom, whether you're an AP, whether you're central office, I would think about what is it that you want to change? How do you start leading by example? In my own classroom, in my own district, I start just asking questions and start bringing people together and making those shifts and asking for, like, I wouldn't say ask for permission, but a lot of times principals want you to do things, but they just don't know that you're capable or that you really know what's happening. People respect when you take that leadership, when you start doing things and showing that you want to make shifts, and that goes a long way. So don't just assume you can't. Start those conversations and start taking leadership from wherever you are. George, are you unmuted or? Oh, I just muted you again. Sorry, dude.
I kind of enjoyed George more muted. Do you, Katie? I don't know.
All right.
I heard you. I can hear you.
No, you're good. We got you. Go ahead.
Hey, Katie and Tom, it is 7 o'clock and we want to honor people's time. Tom, can you give us just a final thought?
Take a step. Do something. You know, George's book in The Innovator's Mindset does an incredible job of encouraging that mindset shift. What's the next step for you? You know, you can watch something like this. You can go to a conference. You can go to the next workshop. But if nothing changes, you do this whole MOOC with The Innovator's Mindset and nothing changes, it was really a waste of time. So what's the next step for you? What is it that you can do to be better for kids tomorrow than you were today? We owe that to our kids. We owe that to ourselves. And as professionals, we take ownership over that. So what's your next step would be my challenge.
Katie?
Hard to top that one. I definitely talk a lot about that a lot, is like do something. But I would also say invest in your community, keep sharing, keep trying new things and helping people understand what's working and what's not. And look to the people in your contacts, build those relationships, and keep doing your best.
And I just want to end it off tonight just saying thank you, Katie, for running this. I know that I haven't been able to be here as much, partly because taking care of some mental health stuff, but also just, you know, doing my own work. And I just want that, I so appreciate people putting your time, and I just want to remind you, take care of yourself. Like, take care of yourself, you know, spend time doing things that are important to you. There's a lot of work that can wait. Nothing has to be done right now. And if you are not healthy, you won't get anything done. So I think that's a really important aspect, is that I know a lot of people are watching this on their own time. That's what we do, is that, you know, we never expect anyone to do something right now, but you need energy to make those things happen. And so I just want to thank you for another awesome season. I know there's still a chat this week, but really want to thank you personally for all that you do. Tom, check out Tom and Eric's book, Learning Transform. There is so much great stuff in there. And the beautiful thing about that is it's a living book, if that makes sense. You can actually tweet them, ask them questions, and you have two people responding to you often, and I really appreciate that about both Tom and Eric. And Tom, thanks for your time tonight. Katie, thanks for all you do, and everyone who participated, thank you so much for you know, taking part in the season of IMMOOC. Thanks.